Tom's hands trembled as he gripped the old leash in his fist. "No way. That can't be him," he whispered, his breath catching in his throat. The Labrador standing at the edge of the yard looked like Buddy. Same golden coat, same bright eyes, but something was off. Something deep in his gut told him this wasn't the same happy, tail-wagging dog who had bolted out the door 3 days ago. Tom had spent the last 72 hours searching every street, every wooded trail, every alley in their quiet Pennsylvania town, calling Buddy's name until his throat burned. Flyers were posted in every coffee shop and gas station, his phone number scrawled in thick black marker. He had barely slept, his mind racing with worst-case scenarios, but nothing had prepared him for this. Buddy stood motionless, his ears twitching as though he was listening to something only he could hear. Tom hesitated before taking a step forward, swallowing hard. "Buddy? Come here, boy." The dog didn't move at first. He just stared, head slightly tilted, tail still. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he took a single step closer, then another. His paws barely made a sound on the grass. The front porch light cast long shadows across his fur, and Tom saw it now. Tiny scratches across his muzzle, dirt clinging to his legs, and something dark near his shoulder. A wound? His heart thumped painfully in his chest as he crouched down, holding out a shaking hand. "Come on, bud. Let's get you inside." The dog stopped just short of his reach, those brown eyes locked onto Tom's face. There was no wag, no excited bark, just silence. And then, as if something inside Buddy finally recognized him, he lurched forward, pressing his face into Tom's chest. Relief flooded through him, and he let out a shaky laugh, wrapping his arms around the dog. "Oh, thank God! Where have you been, boy? What happened to you?" Buddy let out a soft whimper, pushing against him. His body was warm, but something about his weight felt different. Tom pulled back slightly and ran his fingers through his fur, searching for injuries. His fingers brushed against something smooth beneath the dirt, a thin plastic collar, tight against Buddy's neck. His stomach twisted. He hadn't put that there. His heart pounded as he carefully unbuckled the foreign collar and pulled it away. It was plain, no tags, just a strip of sturdy material. Tom frowned, turning it over in his hands. Who had put this on Buddy? Where had he been, and why did he feel like something was watching them from the darkness beyond the trees? Shaking off the unease creeping up his spine, he scooped Buddy into his arms and carried him inside. The dog was heavier than he remembered, but he barely noticed as he kicked the door shut behind them. The warmth of the house wrapped around them both, the familiar scent of home washing over him. "Mom! Dad, he's back!" The sound of hurried footsteps echoed down the hall, and a moment later, his parents appeared in the doorway. His mother gasped, pressing a hand to her chest. "Oh my goodness, Tom! It's him!" His father stepped forward, brow furrowed. "Where did you find him?" "He just showed up outside. But something's wrong," Tom admitted, setting Buddy down carefully. The dog stood still, his ears twitching at every little noise. "Look at him. He's different, and he had this on him." He held up the plastic collar. His mother's face paled as she took the collar from his hands. "Tom, this doesn't look like anything I've ever seen. Are there any markings? A name?" He shook his head. "Nothing. Just plastic." His father knelt down in front of Buddy, running a gentle hand over his fur. "He's filthy. We should clean him up first, check for wounds. If he's hurt, we need to take him to the vet in the morning." Tom nodded, swallowing down the lump in his throat. Yeah. But deep down, a cold feeling settled in his stomach. Buddy was back. But where had he been? And why did it feel like he wasn't alone? Tom sat on the kitchen floor, watching Buddy lap up a bowl of water like he hadn't had a drink in days. His tail flicked slightly, not in excitement, but in an odd, slow rhythm, almost like he was thinking. Tom had grown up with Buddy. He knew every little quirk, every habit. This wasn't the dog he remembered. Buddy finished drinking and lifted his head, staring straight at Tom. Not past him. Not around him. At him. Tom's breath hitched. Something in those brown eyes, something just beneath the surface, wasn't right. He reached out slowly, running a hand along Buddy's back, feeling the dirt crusted into his fur. We're gonna fix this, okay? Whatever happened, we're gonna figure it out. Buddy blinked, then, for the first time since returning home, his tail gave a single wag. Tom let out a shaky breath. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Little did he know, the real mystery was only beginning. Tom hardly slept that night. Every creak of the house, every rustling of leaves outside the window kept him on edge. Buddy had curled up at the foot of his bed like he always used to, but something about the way he settled was different. Too still, too watchful. Tom lay awake, staring at the ceiling, his fingers twitching with the urge to reach out, to touch Buddy's fur, just to be sure he was real. His breathing was deep and steady, but Tom swore he saw the faintest movement of his eyes beneath their lids, like he was dreaming too vividly. But what would he be dreaming of, after 3 days lost in the unknown? Morning light finally filtered in through the blinds, and Tom sat up with a groggy sigh. He stretched, glancing down at Buddy. The dog blinked awake, as if sensing his movement, and lifted his head immediately, eyes locking onto Tom's face. The way he did it sent another small shiver down Tom's spine. It wasn't a lazy morning gaze, nor the sleepy, affectionate glance Buddy used to give him when he was just waking up. It was sharp, alert, calculating. Tom shook off the unease and climbed out of bed. Morning, bud. Let's get you cleaned up, huh? He kept his voice light, forcing himself to treat the situation like any other normal morning. The last thing he wanted was to spook Buddy, or himself. Downstairs, his mom was already making breakfast. The smell of coffee filled the kitchen, comforting in its normalcy. His dad was flipping through the newspaper, glancing up as Tom entered with Buddy trotting silently behind him. "How'd he sleep?" his dad asked. "Fine, I think." Tom filled a bowl with kibble and set it down. Buddy sniffed at it, but didn't start eating right away. Tom frowned, watching him. He's still acting weird, though. His mom turned from the stove, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "We'll take him to the vet after breakfast, just to be safe." Tom nodded, glancing back down at Buddy. The dog finally took a tentative bite of his food, chewing slowly. His usual enthusiasm was gone. No wagging tail, no eager gulping. He wasn't refusing to eat, but it was like he was thinking about it first. Tom slid into a chair at the table, drumming his fingers against the wood. What if something happened to him out there? Something bad? He didn't even know what he meant by that, but he had to voice it. His dad set the newspaper down. 3 days is a long time for a dog to be missing, but he's home now. That's what matters. Tom wasn't sure if he agreed. Buddy was home. But was he really Buddy? The drive to the vet was quiet. Buddy sat in the back seat, staring out the window without much interest. Usually he would be bouncing with excitement, panting against the glass. Today, he barely moved. Tom kept sneaking glances at him, hoping for some sign of familiarity, something that reassured him he was overthinking all of this. But nothing changed. The vet, Dr. Peterson, was an older man with kind eyes and a patient smile. He'd known Buddy since he was a puppy, giving him checkups and vaccinations over the years. Tom watched closely as he examined Buddy, pressing his fingers along his ribs, checking his ears and eyes. When he lifted Buddy's paw, the dog didn't resist. He just let it happen, staring straight ahead. Dr. Peterson frowned slightly. He's in good health, surprisingly. No signs of malnutrition or major injuries. He's a little dehydrated, but nothing severe. He paused, his fingers brushing against Buddy's neck. You said he came back with a collar that wasn't his? Tom nodded. Yeah, it was some kind of plastic thing, no tags. It was really tight. Dr. Peterson stepped back, rubbing his chin. Has he been acting differently? Tom hesitated. Yeah, I mean, he's quiet. He doesn't really react like he used to. It's like he's just watching everything. Dr. Peterson didn't answer right away. He knelt in front of Buddy again, searching his face. Buddy stared back at him, unblinking. The vet gave a soft exhale and stood up. I don't see anything medically wrong with him. Physically, he's fine, but I'd keep a close eye on his behavior. Sometimes when animals go missing for a few days, they experience stress or trauma. It might take him some time to settle back in. Tom nodded, but something about the way Dr. Peterson said it felt too simple. There was more to this. He could feel it. Back home, the air felt heavy. Even with Buddy curled up in his usual spot on the couch, Tom couldn't shake the feeling that something was pressing down on him, something unseen. He sat across from Buddy, studying him, watching every slow rise and fall of his chest. His mom and dad had gone out for a few errands, leaving him alone with the dog. Normally, that wouldn't bother him. He and Buddy had spent plenty of afternoons like this. Just the two of them. But today, the silence felt different. Buddy lifted his head and looked straight at Tom. Tom swallowed. Hey, Bud, you okay? Buddy's head tilted slightly. Not in a playful, curious way. In a way that felt like he was considering the question. Tom's stomach twisted. Okay, this is ridiculous. You're just tired, right? You had a rough couple of days. You just need time. Buddy didn't react. He just kept looking at him. Tom stood, shaking his head. He needed to do something normal, get out of the house for a bit. He grabbed his jacket and whistled. Come on, let's go for a walk. That always makes you feel better. Buddy followed, but something about his steps felt precise, measured. Like he wasn't just walking, he was following. The fresh air should have helped. The sun was out, the sky a crisp blue, birds chirping in the trees. Everything was normal. Perfectly normal. But every step Tom took down the sidewalk, every time he felt Buddy's presence just slightly behind him, the unease grew. It wasn't until they reached the park that the feeling truly settled deep in his bones. A few kids were playing on the swings, a couple walking their golden retriever on the other side of the field. Buddy stopped suddenly, his body going rigid. Tom followed his gaze. The golden retriever across the park had stopped too. Its owner tugged gently on the leash, but the dog didn't move. It just stared at Buddy, ears pinned back, tail tucked slightly. Buddy stared back. Neither of them moved. Tom's pulse quickened. Buddy? Come on, let's keep going. Buddy didn't react. His muscles were tense, his breathing slow and steady. The golden retriever let out a low, uneasy whine, then suddenly turned, dragging its owner away in the opposite direction. Buddy's head tilted slightly as he watched them go, as if he had expected that. Tom exhaled, his grip tightening on the leash. "Okay, that was weird. Let's go home." Buddy turned his head toward him, and for a split second, Tom had the strongest sensation that he was being examined. Not just looked at, studied. He swallowed and turned back toward the house, gripping the leash a little tighter. He couldn't explain it, but he suddenly felt the need to get home as fast as possible. Tom barely spoke the rest of the day. His mind kept circling back to the way Buddy had acted in the park, the way that other dog had responded to him. He couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was going on, something just outside of his understanding. Every time he glanced at Buddy, the dog was watching him, never with that same eager affection he used to, but with something else, something unreadable. It sent a chill down his spine. His parents didn't seem to notice. They were just happy Buddy was home, making comments about how he'd settle in soon, and how it's just stress. But Tom knew better. This wasn't just stress. That night, as he lay in bed, he listened to the quiet sounds of the house. The faint ticking of the clock downstairs, the occasional creak of the wood settling. Buddy's slow, steady breathing. Tom turned onto his side, peering at the dog curled up at the foot of his bed. His eyes were closed, but Tom had the strangest feeling that he wasn't asleep. The thought unsettled him more than it should have. Finally, exhaustion won out, and he drifted off. He didn't sleep for long. Something woke him in the middle of the night. A noise, soft but distinct. A shuffling, followed by a barely audible click. Tom's heart pounded as he blinked in the darkness, adjusting his eyes. He turned his head toward the bedroom door. It was slightly open, though he knew he had closed it before bed. His stomach tightened. Buddy was no longer on the bed. A cold wave of fear washed over him. He slowly pushed himself up, listening carefully. The house was silent. Too silent. He swung his legs over the edge of the bed and crept toward the doorway, swallowing hard. As he stepped into the hallway, he felt a strange sensation, like the air had changed. It was cooler than before, but not in a natural way. Almost like something was drawing the warmth out of the space. His pulse quickened as he carefully made his way down the stairs. Buddy was standing near the front door, not sitting, not lying down, standing perfectly still, his head tilted slightly upward as if he were listening to something just beyond the door. His tail was still, his body motionless. It was eerie, unnatural. Tom's voice came out barely above a whisper. "Buddy, what are you doing?" The dog didn't react. He just stood there, staring at the door. Tom hesitated, then slowly stepped forward. His socked feet barely made a sound against the wooden floor. The closer he got, the more he noticed it. The rigidness in Buddy's posture, the way his ears twitched ever so slightly. Tom glanced at the door, half expecting to see something through the peephole. But there was nothing. Just darkness beyond the small glass pane. He hesitated before reaching out and placing a hand on Buddy's back. The second he made contact, Buddy's entire body tensed. Tom yanked his hand back. "Buddy?" Slowly, the dog turned his head toward him. The motion was smooth, too smooth, as if it wasn't entirely natural. Tom's breath caught in his throat. For the first time since Buddy had returned, a flicker of something passed through his expression. It wasn't fear, wasn't confusion. It was knowing. Tom took a step back, suddenly feeling an overwhelming urge to put distance between himself and his dog. But Buddy didn't move. He just stared, unblinking. Then, in a motion almost too quick to follow, Buddy turned back toward the door and sat down. Just like that, as if nothing had happened. Tom's heart pounded in his ears. He had no idea what to do. Waking his parents wouldn't help. They'd tell him he was imagining things, that Buddy was just adjusting. But Tom knew what he had seen. And more than anything, he knew what he had felt. Something was wrong. But Buddy was still his dog, right? Morning came too slowly. Tom barely got any sleep after that. He had stayed in his room, listening for any other signs of movement, but Buddy never left his spot by the door. It wasn't until the sun rose that he finally got up the nerve to go downstairs again. His parents were already up, making breakfast. Buddy was in the kitchen, sitting next to his dad's chair like he always used to. He looked normal. At least, as normal as he had been since coming back. Tom hesitated before stepping inside, forcing himself to act like nothing was wrong. "Morning, Bud," his dad greeted him. "Did you sleep better?" Tom swallowed. "Yeah." He sat down at the table, glancing at Buddy. The dog was focused on his father, eyes watching every move he made. Tom took a slow breath, forcing himself to eat. "You know," his mom said, "I was thinking, maybe we should take Buddy to that behavioral specialist in town, just to see if they have any insight into why he's acting like this." Tom's heart leapt at the suggestion. Yeah, that's a good idea." His dad nodded. "Might be worth a try. I mean, if nothing else, we can at least get some peace of mind." They called the specialist and made an appointment for the next day. Tom felt slightly relieved, knowing they were doing something, but even with that small comfort, a nagging feeling remained in the back of his mind. That night, Tom kept his bedroom door locked. He told himself it was just a precaution, that it was just until they figured things out. But as he lay in bed, staring at the darkened ceiling, he couldn't ignore the quiet sound of footsteps pacing just outside his door. And deep down, he knew Buddy wasn't sleeping. Tom woke up to the sound of rain tapping against his window, a steady, rhythmic patter that should have been soothing. But his body was stiff, tense from a restless night, and the uneasy feeling that had settled deep in his bones refused to fade. His mind kept replaying the sound of the footsteps outside his door, over and over, until the memory felt more real than a dream. He turned his head toward the foot of his bed. Buddy was there again, curled up the same way he had been the night before. Tom swallowed hard, watching the slow rise and fall of the dog's chest. The feeling of being watched hadn't gone away, not entirely, but at least now Buddy was sleeping. Or at least pretending to. A knock on his door made him jump. His mom's voice filtered through the wood. "Tom, you up?" He cleared his throat, trying to sound normal. "Yeah. Come down for breakfast soon. We need to leave for Buddy's appointment in an hour." He sat up, rubbing his eyes. "All right." The mention of the appointment should have made him feel better, but instead, it left him with an odd sense of apprehension. What if the specialist couldn't explain what was happening? What if they said Buddy was perfectly fine, that everything was in his head? The idea of being left with no answers was worse than any explanation, no matter how strange. He got dressed quickly and headed downstairs. His parents were already at the table, his dad sipping coffee, his mom scrolling through something on her phone. Buddy padded in behind him, taking his usual spot beside his dad's chair. "You sleep okay?" his dad asked, eyeing him over the rim of his mug. "Yeah," Tom lied. He sat down, grabbing a piece of toast. "Just weird dreams?" His mom looked up. Still feeling off about Buddy? He hesitated. I don't know. He's acting normal now, but I can't shake the feeling that something happened to him out there. I mean, he's still not himself. His dad set his coffee down. That's why we're going to the specialist, right? He reached down and scratched Buddy behind the ears. Maybe he just needs some time. Tom nodded, but doubt still lingered in his mind. Time wouldn't change the fact that Buddy had disappeared for 3 days with no explanation. It wouldn't change the way that other dog had reacted to him in the park. And it certainly wouldn't change the way Buddy had stood at the door last night, listening to something that Tom couldn't hear. The drive to the specialist was quiet. Buddy sat in the back seat again, staring out the window like he had before. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, the sky still heavy with gray clouds. Tom kept glancing at Buddy in the rearview mirror, half expecting something strange to happen, but the dog just sat there, unmoving, watching. They arrived at the clinic, a small, cozy building with a bright blue sign out front. Dr. Langford greeted them with a warm smile. She was in her 40s, with sharp but kind eyes, her brown hair tied back in a ponytail. Tom felt a flicker of hope. If anyone could help, maybe she could. So, she said, kneeling down to Buddy's level. I hear someone's been acting a little different lately. Buddy didn't react to her voice. He just stood there, still as ever. Dr. Langford's smile faltered slightly, but she recovered quickly. She reached out a hand, offering it to Buddy to sniff. Buddy didn't move. The air in the room seemed to tighten. Tom's parents exchanged a glance. Dr. Langford waited a moment longer, then pulled her hand back, her brows knitting together in thought. All right, she said, standing up. Let's take him into the exam room and see if we can figure out what's going on. Tom followed as she led Buddy through the door. The room was bright, clinical, with a steel table in the center. Buddy jumped up onto it with no resistance. Dr. Langford began her examination, her hands moving carefully over his body, checking his ears, his eyes, his paws. Tom watched her face, looking for any sign of concern, but her expression remained neutral. Then she paused. Her fingers ran along the back of Buddy's neck, stopping just below the spot where his collar usually sat. She frowned, pressing lightly against the skin. What is it? Tom asked, his voice tight. Dr. Langford didn't answer right away. She moved to a nearby cabinet, pulling out a small handheld device that Tom recognized as a microchip scanner. Just checking something, she murmured. She ran the scanner over Buddy's neck. A soft beep filled the room. Tom's stomach twisted. Dr. Langford's frown deepened. That's odd. Tom's dad stepped forward. What is it? She turned the scanner toward them. Buddy's microchip is still here, but there's something else, another frequency, like there's a second device under his skin. Tom's heart pounded. What? Dr. Langford glanced at Buddy, then at Tom. I'd like to take an X-ray, just to be sure. Tom's parents hesitated, exchanging another look. But Tom already knew what he wanted to say. Do it. They moved Buddy into the X-ray room. Tom waited outside, his hands clenched into fists. His mind raced, trying to make sense of it. A second device? What did that even mean? When Dr. Langford returned, she was holding the scan in her hands. She placed it on the light board, flipping the switch. The image illuminated, showing Buddy's skeleton in clear detail. And there, just beneath the skin on the back of his neck, was a small, foreign object. Tom's breath caught. What is that? Dr. Langford traced the outline with her finger. It's not a regular microchip. It's too small, too precise. I don't know what it is, but it's not something that should be there. Tom's dad exhaled sharply. "How did it even get there?" Dr. Langford shook her head. "I don't know. The only way to find out is to remove it." Tom swallowed. His throat was dry. "Can you do that?" She nodded. "It's a simple procedure. I can do it today." Tom looked at Buddy. The dog sat calmly on the table, staring at the wall, as if none of this concerned him. But Tom knew better now. He knew something was deeply wrong. His mom placed a hand on his shoulder. "What do you want to do?" Tom took a deep breath. "Take it out." Dr. Langford nodded and prepped for the procedure. As Tom watched, a sinking feeling settled in his stomach. This was just the beginning. Whatever had happened to Buddy during those 3 missing days, they were only starting to uncover the truth. And Tom wasn't sure he was ready for it. Tom sat in the waiting room, his leg bouncing up and down as the minutes stretched into what felt like hours. His parents sat across from him, his mom flipping through a magazine without really reading, and his dad watching the closed exam room door with a deep frown. None of them spoke, but the tension in the air was thick enough to weigh down on his chest. When Dr. Langford finally emerged, pulling off her gloves, Tom shot to his feet. "Well?" he asked, his voice tight. "What was it?" She sighed, glancing between him and his parents before motioning for them to follow her back into the exam room. Buddy was lying on the table, still drowsy from the mild sedative, his chest rising and falling in an even rhythm. The sight of him so still made Tom's stomach twist, but he quickly looked up at the tray beside Dr. Langford. A small metallic object sat there, about the size of a grain of rice, but sleek, dark, with no visible markings. "That's what we removed," Dr. Langford said, carefully picking it up with tweezers. "It's unlike any microchip I've ever seen. I had to be extra careful. There were thin fibers attached to it, almost like tiny tendrils. It was embedded deeper than a normal microchip would be." Tom swallowed hard. "Do you know what it is?" Dr. Langford shook her head. "Not yet. But I know this. Whoever put this in him didn't want it to be found." A cold chill ran down Tom's spine. "I can send it to a specialist for analysis," Dr. Langford continued. "But that could take some time. If you want my honest opinion, I'd be careful. If this device was tracking him, or worse, influencing him in some way, we might not know the full effects yet." Tom's mom sucked in a breath. "Influencing him?" Dr. Langford nodded. "I don't want to jump to conclusions, but if Buddy's behavior has been different, there's a possibility this device was affecting his brain signals. Dogs are incredibly receptive to stimuli, and if something was altering his instincts or emotions, that could explain why he's been acting so strange." Tom looked at Buddy again, his heart aching. What had they done to him? What had happened during those 3 days? His dad cleared his throat. "So what now?" Dr. Langford sighed. "Now we wait and observe. I'll send this for analysis, but in the meantime, keep a close eye on Buddy. See if his behavior changes now that the device is gone. If anything strange happens, call me immediately." Tom nodded, feeling an odd mix of relief and fear. They had taken something out of Buddy, but that didn't mean the mystery was solved. If anything, it was only getting deeper. They brought Buddy home later that afternoon, letting him rest in his usual spot by the couch. He was groggy for a while, barely moving except to shift positions, but by the evening he was awake again, stretching and yawning. Tom sat on the floor beside him, running his fingers through his fur. "Hey, bud, you feeling any better?" Buddy blinked slowly at him, then nudged his hand with his nose. It was the first sign of affection he'd shown since coming back, and Tom's throat tightened. Maybe, just maybe, they were on the right path. But as the night stretched on, that lingering unease never fully left him. The thought of that device, of the way Buddy had been acting before, gnawed at his thoughts. He kept telling himself that things would be better now, that whatever had been done to Buddy was gone. And yet, a small voice in the back of his mind whispered, "What if it's not over?" By the next morning, Buddy seemed more like himself. He followed Tom around the house like he used to, wagging his tail and even barking when the mailman came. Tom's mom was relieved, her smile coming more easily. But Tom still felt wary. Was it real? Or was he just imagining that things were back to normal? The next few days passed in a blur of normalcy. Buddy ate, played, and even ran around the yard with his usual enthusiasm. It was like nothing had ever happened. But Tom couldn't stop waiting for something to go wrong. Then, on the fourth night, he woke up to the sound of scratching. He sat up abruptly, heart hammering. The noise was coming from downstairs. He glanced at the clock, 2:14 a.m. Carefully, he swung his legs over the bed, creeping toward his bedroom door. He opened it slowly, listening. The house was quiet, except for the soft, steady scratching coming from below. His skin prickled. "Buddy?" Moving as quietly as possible, he descended the stairs. His breath caught when he saw Buddy standing by the front door, his paws pressing lightly against the wood. His ears were up, his body rigid. He wasn't trying to get out. He was listening. Tom swallowed. "Buddy?" Buddy didn't move. Tom stepped closer. "What is it?" Buddy's head turned slightly, as if acknowledging him, but his focus remained on whatever was beyond the door. A new sound made Tom freeze. A faint rustling just outside. He barely breathed. Someone was out there. Buddy's tail was still, his body tense. He wasn't barking. He wasn't growling. He was waiting. Tom's fingers curled into fists. He reached for the curtain beside the door, hesitating before pulling it aside just enough to peek through the window. Nothing. Just the darkened front yard, the empty street beyond. And yet the unease didn't fade. If anything, it deepened. Buddy finally turned, stepping away from the door and looking up at Tom. His expression was unreadable, but something in his eyes made Tom's chest tighten. Like Buddy knew something he didn't. And whatever it wasn't over yet. Tom barely slept after that night. Every little sound made him jolt awake, his pulse hammering in his ears. Buddy seemed fine during the day, maybe even better than before. But at night, something shifted. He never barked, never growled, but he would always end up near the front door, staring, listening. His parents didn't notice, too relieved that Buddy was back to normal to pick up on the smaller details. Tom didn't know how to bring it up without sounding paranoid, so he kept quiet. But his gut told him something was still wrong. The next morning, he decided to take Buddy for a longer walk, hoping the fresh air would settle his own nerves. The sky was overcast, a thick blanket of gray clouds stretching over the town. They walked the familiar route through the park, past the old oak tree where Buddy used to love sniffing around. For the first time in days, things almost felt normal. Almost. As they rounded a bend, Buddy suddenly stopped. His ears perked, his body stiffening. Tom followed his gaze toward a cluster of trees by the edge of the park. At first he saw nothing. Just branches swaying in the breeze, the occasional rustling of leaves. But then, just for a second, he thought he saw movement. A figure, barely visible through the trees, standing still, watching. A prickle ran down Tom's spine. His grip on Buddy's leash tightened. "Come on, bud. Let's go," Buddy hesitated for a moment longer, then turned, walking alongside Tom again. But his head kept swiveling back, ears twitching. Tom forced himself to keep moving, his pace quickening. By the time they made it home, his hands were clammy. He double-checked the locks on the door before letting out a shaky breath. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was just some random person out for a walk. But deep down, he didn't believe that. That night, he barely ate dinner, pushing his food around his plate while his parents talked about weekend plans. Buddy sat by his feet, still and silent. When his mom finally asked if he was feeling okay, he just nodded, forcing a small smile. Yeah, just tired. It wasn't a lie, not really. By midnight, Tom was wide awake again. The house was silent. He stared at the ceiling, listening to the faint hum of the fridge downstairs. The clock ticked steadily, marking the slow passage of time. Then he heard it, the soft scratch of nails against the wood floor. Tom turned his head. Buddy was standing by the door again, just like before. But this time, he wasn't looking at the front door. He was looking at the window. A cold wave of fear crashed over Tom. He sat up slowly, his heart pounding. The curtains were drawn, blocking the view outside, but he could feel it, that same eerie sensation of being watched. Buddy didn't move. He just stood there, tail low, body rigid. Tom swallowed hard and slipped out of bed, moving carefully to the window. His fingers trembled as he reached for the curtain. He hesitated. Then, in one swift motion, he yanked it aside. Nothing. Just the backyard, empty and still under the dim glow of the street lamp. The fence was intact, the trees swaying slightly in the wind. No sign of anyone. But Buddy's posture didn't change. Tom exhaled shakily and let the curtain fall back into place. He turned to Buddy. "There's nothing there, Bud." Buddy blinked, his tail giving a single, slow wag. But somehow, that didn't make Tom feel any better. The next day, he couldn't shake the lingering unease. He decided to take action. If something, or someone, was out there, he needed proof. He spent the afternoon researching security cameras, eventually convincing his dad to buy one for the front yard. They set it up together, mounting it above the porch. It was motion-activated and linked to an app on Tom's phone. That night, Tom lay in bed, staring at his screen. Every few minutes, he checked the app, watching the live feed of the porch. Nothing moved. The street was quiet. He checked again at 1:00 a.m., still nothing. Then at 2:37 a.m., the camera detected motion. Tom bolted upright, his fingers fumbling as he opened the app. The feed loaded, grainy in the low light. For a second, he thought it was just the wind. Then he saw it. A figure. Just at the edge of the yard, standing still. Tom's breath hitched. The figure wasn't moving, just standing there, barely visible beyond the glow of the street lamp. He couldn't make out any features, but the shape was unmistakable. Human. Watching. A cold sweat broke out across his skin. His stomach twisted. He wanted to wake his parents, call the police, do something, but he was frozen in place, staring at the screen. And then, just as suddenly as it appeared, the figure stepped back, disappearing into the darkness. The motion alert stopped. The yard was empty again. Tom sat there for a long time, phone clenched in his shaking hands. Buddy hadn't moved from his spot by the door. Morning couldn't come fast enough. As soon as his parents were awake, Tom told them everything. The strange nights, Buddy's behavior, the camera footage. His dad immediately pulled up the app, watching the clip with a deep frown. His mom covered her mouth. "Someone was out there?" Tom nodded. "I don't know who, but they were watching." His dad exhaled sharply. "We're calling the police." For the first time in days, Tom felt a sliver of relief. Someone else would know now. Someone else would look into it. The officers arrived later that afternoon, reviewing the footage carefully. They took notes, asked questions, then did a quick sweep of the yard. But they found nothing. No footprints, no signs of forced entry, just an empty space where someone had stood. "We'll keep an eye on the area," one of the officers said. "But if you see anything else, let us know right away." Tom nodded, but he could tell they didn't think it was serious. Just some random person passing by. Nothing to worry about. But Tom knew better. That night, he kept the camera feed open on his phone. Watching. Waiting. And when Buddy rose from his spot by the door, ears twitching, Tom knew it wasn't over. Tom barely left his room the next day. He kept his phone in his hand, watching the security app like a lifeline. His parents had tried to act like everything was fine, like a simple call to the police had solved the problem. But Tom knew better. The figure in the yard hadn't been a coincidence. It hadn't just been someone passing by. It had been watching. Waiting. Buddy was still acting strange. During the day, he was almost normal, tail wagging, ears perking up at familiar sounds, even nudging Tom's hand like he used to. But at night, the stillness returned. The waiting. Tom didn't understand it, but he felt it deep in his chest, like a warning. Something was coming. By the time the sun set, he was exhausted but wired, unable to shake the feeling that another long night was ahead of him. He checked the locks on the doors twice before heading upstairs. The security camera was working, the motion alerts set to high sensitivity. If anything moved outside, he'd know about it. But the question was, what would he do when it happened? Tom left his bedside lamp on as he lay under the covers, phone resting on his chest. Buddy was at the foot of the bed, breathing slow and steady. Tom wished he could feel comforted by his presence, but something about it still felt off. He hadn't forgotten the way Buddy had stared at the door, the way he had listened, like he understood something Tom didn't. He closed his eyes, but sleep refused to come. Minutes stretched into hours, his body heavy with exhaustion, but his mind racing. Every little creak in the house made him tense. Every shift in the shadows outside his window made his pulse jump. Then, at exactly 2:46 a.m., his phone vibrated in his hand. Motion detected. Tom's breath caught in his throat. His fingers fumbled as he pulled up the camera feed. The screen loaded slowly, the grainy image appearing in black and white. His stomach dropped. The figure was back. Standing in the exact same spot as before. Unmoving. Watching. Tom's skin went cold. He didn't breathe. He just stared at the screen, heart hammering so hard he could hear it in his ears. The figure was closer this time. Not on the sidewalk, not at the edge of the yard. Closer, right by the tree near the porch. The seconds dragged. He waited for it to move, to shift, to do something. But it didn't. It just stood there, watching. Then, as if sensing him, Buddy lifted his head from the bed. He turned to look at Tom, his ears twitching, and then he turned toward the window. Tom's stomach twisted. Slowly, carefully, he slid out of bed, inching toward the curtain. His fingers trembled as he reached out, gripping the fabric. He pulled it back just a sliver, enough to peek through. The yard was empty. but the camera still showed the figure. A cold dread filled Tom's chest. He shut the curtain quickly and backed away, his mind racing. How was that possible? The feed was live. It wasn't a recording. If the figure was there, he should have seen it with his own eyes. Buddy let out a low whine. Tom turned to him, his voice barely a whisper. "You see it too, don't you?" Buddy didn't move. He just stared at the window. Tom's hands were shaking as he looked at his phone again. The figure still hadn't moved. The security system recorded in short clips when motion was detected, so he tapped the most recent one, rewinding a few seconds to see if there had been any movement. He nearly dropped the phone. The figure had been standing near the tree. Then, in the blink of an eye, it was at the porch steps. Tom's breath hitched. He scrambled backward, nearly tripping over himself. His hands were sweaty, gripping the phone like a lifeline. He hit the playback again. Near the tree. Then at the porch. The movement hadn't been gradual. It hadn't stepped forward, hadn't walked. It had just appeared. He stared at the screen, pulse hammering. His gut screamed at him to do something. Anything. But his body was frozen in fear. Then, for the first time, the figure moved. Not toward the house, not toward the camera. It turned, slowly, and looked directly at the lens. Tom's breath hitched. The screen flickered. Then the feed cut out, darkness. The phone slipped from his hands, hitting the floor with a dull thud. Then, from downstairs, he heard a noise. A sharp, deliberate knock on the front door. Buddy let out a low, warning growl. Tom didn't move. He couldn't. Every instinct screamed at him to stay put, to stay silent, to pretend he wasn't home. The knock came again. Louder this time, more insistent. Buddy rose from the bed, his tail stiff, his body rigid. Then, in the heavy silence that followed, the sound of the door handle turning sent a wave of terror crashing over Tom. Someone was trying to get inside. His legs finally unlocked. He grabbed his phone from the floor, fingers shaking as he tapped the security app again. The feed was still down. No connection. He couldn't see who was there. The door handle jiggled again. Then a voice, low, distorted, barely audible through the door. "Tom." His blood ran ice cold. Buddy's growl deepened. The voice came again. Closer, as if leaning against the door. "Let me in!" Tom clamped a hand over his mouth, his breath coming fast and shallow. His heart pounded so hard he thought it might burst from his chest. The knocking stopped. Silence stretched. Suffocating. Endless. Then, a single, deliberate scrape against the door. Slow. Purposeful. Tom couldn't breathe. Then the voice spoke one last time. "See you soon." A chill ran down his spine. The air in the room felt thin. He stayed frozen in place, listening, waiting. Minutes passed, then an hour, but no other sounds came. Eventually he forced himself to stand, legs weak beneath him. He crept to the window, pressing a hand to the curtain. Slowly, he pulled it back. The yard was empty. His phone buzzed in his hand. He looked down, swallowing hard. Motion detected. Tom didn't check the footage. He already knew what it would show. Tom barely slept after that night. Every little noise made him jump. Every shadow in the hallway stretched too long, seemed too dark. The motion alerts kept coming, but he refused to check them. He already knew what they would show. The next morning, his parents noticed something was off. His mom kept looking at him over breakfast, concern etched across her face. Honey, are you feeling okay? Tom pushed his cereal around his bowl, his appetite long gone. Yeah, just tired. His dad frowned. You look like you didn't sleep at all. Something on your mind? Tom hesitated. He wanted to tell them everything, the figure, the camera feed, the knocking on the door. But how could he? They wouldn't believe him. They'd tell him it was a prank, a trick of the light, or worse, that he was just imagining things. I'm fine, he said, forcing a small smile. Just stressed about school. His mom didn't look convinced, but she let it go. The day passed in a blur. At school, he couldn't focus. Every time he glanced out a window, he half expected to see something standing there, watching him. The feeling of being followed clung to him like a second skin. Buddy's strange behavior, the voice at the door, he couldn't shake the thought that whatever was happening wasn't over. If anything, it was getting worse. By the time he got home, the unease had settled so deep in his stomach that he felt sick. The sun was already dipping below the horizon, casting long, golden light across the yard. Buddy was waiting for him at the door, tail wagging, but there was something off in his eyes, something unreadable. Tom reached down and scratched behind his ears. Hey, Bud, you okay? Buddy leaned into his touch, but his body was still. Too still. Tom swallowed hard and glanced at the security camera above the porch. He'd left the app closed all day, refusing to look, but now he needed to know. Taking a deep breath, he pulled out his phone and opened the app. There were new motion alerts. His stomach tightened as he clicked the latest one. The video loaded, grainy in the fading light. At first, nothing seemed unusual. The porch, the yard, the street beyond. Empty. Then, just as he was about to exit the app, something flickered at the edge of the screen. A figure. Tom's pulse pounded in his ears. The figure was standing just outside the frame, barely visible behind the tree near the driveway, watching. And then, in the next frame, it was gone. His breath caught. He played the clip again. The figure appeared, then vanished. Not walked away, not faded into the shadows, just gone. Tom's hands felt ice cold. He looked down at Buddy, who was still watching him, ears perked. Did he know? Could he sense it too? That night, Tom kept his bedroom door locked. He left the lamp on. The security app stayed open on his phone, the camera feed refreshing every few minutes. He told himself he wouldn't sleep, that he'd stay awake just in case. But at some point, exhaustion won. And then he heard it. Knocking. Tom's eyes flew open, his chest tight with fear. The knocking was soft this time, almost hesitant. Not like the night before, but somehow that made it worse. He turned his head slowly. Buddy was at the door again, standing perfectly still. The knocking came again. 3 short raps. Then a voice. Tom. His blood ran cold. It was the same distorted whisper as before, muffled through the door. But this time, it wasn't asking to come in. This time, it was laughing. A slow, quiet chuckle just beneath the surface of the wood. Buddy let out a deep, low growl. Tom's entire body was frozen, his breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. He didn't move. He didn't make a sound. The laughter stopped. Silence. Then the voice spoke again. I see you. Tom's vision swam. His fingers dug into the blankets, knuckles white. He wanted to scream, to run, to do anything. But all he could do was sit there paralyzed, Then, all at once, the presence outside the door was gone. The air in the room shifted, like something had been lifted. Buddy stepped back from the door, his posture relaxing slightly. But Tom didn't move. He couldn't. When morning came, he barely remembered falling asleep. He woke up still curled under the covers, the lamp still on, Buddy still at his feet. He checked his phone with trembling fingers. There was a new motion alert. With his heart in his throat, he tapped the notification. The footage loaded, the porch coming into view. And there, just beyond the streetlight's glow, something was standing in the middle of the road, watching the house. Tom's breath caught. The figure didn't move. It didn't shift. It just stood there, a dark silhouette against the pavement. Then, in the last second of the clip, it did something new. It raised a hand and waved. Tom's hands trembled as he watched the video over and over again. The way the figure stood motionless in the road, the way it lifted its hand in that slow, deliberate wave. It was as if it knew he was watching, as if it wanted him to see. He could barely breathe. His body felt like it had been locked in place, his fingers gripping the phone so tightly his knuckles turned white. The footage ended, the screen returning to the live feed. The street outside was empty now, but Tom knew better. The figure would be back. He barely noticed Buddy moving beside him, shifting his weight until his head rested against Tom's leg. It was the first comforting thing he had felt in days, but even Buddy's warmth couldn't chase away the fear curling deep in his stomach. Morning light filtered through his window, a pale contrast to the dark thoughts circling his mind. He had to do something. He couldn't keep living like this, watching, waiting, feeling like a shadow was breathing down his neck. Tom forced himself to move, swinging his legs over the side of the bed and rubbing his face. His exhaustion clung to him like a second skin, but he pushed it away, focusing instead on what he needed to do next. He had to find out what was going on. He had to figure out who or what was watching him. His parents were already in the kitchen by the time he came downstairs, talking in hushed voices over coffee. They looked up when he entered, their expressions soft with concern. "Tom," his mom said carefully, "you're up early. Everything okay?" He hesitated, debating how much to tell them. They already thought he was overreacting. If he showed them the footage, would they finally believe him? Or would they dismiss it as another trick of the light, another unexplained coincidence? "Yeah," he lied. "I just didn't sleep much." His dad sighed. "Tom, if something's bothering you, you can tell us. We want to help." He almost did. The word sat on the tip of his tongue, waiting to be spoken. But something inside him held back. Maybe it was fear. Maybe it was the nagging feeling that even if they saw what he had seen, they still wouldn't understand. "I'm fine," he repeated, forcing a small smile. "Just tired." His mom studied him for a moment longer before nodding. "All right, but if you need to talk, we're here." Tom nodded, grabbing an apple from the counter before heading outside. The crisp morning air did little to calm his nerves. He turned his phone over in his hands, debating his next move. He could go to the police again, but what would he say? That a shadowy figure had been standing outside his house, waving at him through the camera. They hadn't found anything last time. What would make this any different? Instead, he made his way down the sidewalk, Buddy trotting at his side. His feet carried him toward the park without much thought, his mind too preoccupied to focus on anything else. The place where he had first seen the figure. The place where Buddy had first started acting strangely. The park was nearly empty this early in the morning. The air was still, the trees swaying gently with the breeze. Tom walked slowly, scanning the area, searching for something. Anything that might give him a clue. And then he saw it. Near the edge of the park, nestled between two trees, was something half buried in the dirt. Tom's heart pounded as he approached, dropping to one knee. Carefully, he brushed away the loose soil, revealing something cold and metallic beneath. It was a small, rectangular device. No markings, no buttons, just a smooth, featureless surface. His fingers trembled as he picked it up. The second he did, Buddy let out a low growl, his body going rigid beside him. Tom swallowed hard. "What is this?" The device felt heavier than it should have, like it was filled with something dense, something important. He turned it over in his hands, searching for any clue as to what it was. And then, without warning, it lit up. A single red light blinked at the center of the device, pulsing like a heartbeat. Buddy's growl deepened. Tom's breath hitched. He had no idea what he was holding, but every instinct screamed at him to put it down. He glanced around the park, suddenly feeling exposed. Was someone watching him right now? Had they left this here for him to find? He needed answers. He needed help. His fingers tightened around the device as he turned and ran, Buddy keeping pace beside him. The only person who might know what to do was Dr. Langford. She had found the strange chip inside Buddy. Maybe she could figure out what this was too. The run back home felt longer than it should have, his lungs burning with every step. When he finally reached his house, he didn't stop. He grabbed his bike from the garage and pedaled toward Dr. Langford's clinic as fast as he could. By the time he arrived, he was out of breath. He rushed inside, ignoring the receptionist's surprised expression. "I need to see Dr. Langford," he said quickly. "It's urgent." The receptionist hesitated before nodding. "She's with a patient right now, but I'll let her know you're here." Tom paced the waiting room, his heart hammering. Buddy sat beside him, still tense, his ears flicking at every sound. A few minutes later, Dr. Langford appeared, her brow furrowed. "Tom? What's wrong?" He didn't waste time. He held out the device. "I found this in the park. It lit up when I picked it up. I think it's connected to what's been happening." Dr. Langford took it carefully, her eyes narrowing. "Where exactly did you find this?" "Near the trees at the edge of the park. It was buried. I don't know who put it there." She turned it over in her hands, studying the blinking red light. "This isn't a normal tracker. It's emitting a low-frequency signal. Something advanced. Where have you seen something like this before?" Tom swallowed. "The chip you took out of Buddy." Dr. Langford's expression darkened. "You think they're connected?" "I don't know, but I think someone put this there on purpose, and I think they were waiting for me to find it." Dr. Langford exhaled sharply. "We need to be careful. If this is sending out a signal, we don't know who or what is listening." Tom's skin prickled. "So what do we do?" She looked at him, her expression grim. "First we turn it off. Then we figure out who left it there." Tom nodded, but deep down he knew the truth. Whoever left it there already knew he had it. And they were watching. Tom watched as Dr. Langford carefully turned the device over in her hands, her eyes narrowed with concentration. The blinking red light pulsed steadily, an eerie rhythm that seemed almost alive. His pulse matched its pace, thudding in his ears. "Can you turn it off?" he asked, his voice tight. Dr. Langford exhaled slowly. "I can try." She reached for a small set of tools on her desk, selecting a thin screwdriver and a pair of precision tweezers. But I have to be careful. If this is some kind of transmitter, we don't know what tampering with it might do. Tom swallowed, nodding. He didn't like the idea of waiting any longer, but he trusted her more than anyone else at this point. She adjusted her glasses and began working. Buddy sat at Tom's feet, watching intently. His ears twitched at every slight movement of the device, his muscles tensed as though he expected something to happen. Tom absently scratched behind Buddy's ears, trying to reassure both of them. Minutes passed in silence as Dr. Langford worked. The tiny screws were stubborn, the casing refusing to budge at first. But finally, with a soft click, the back panel loosened. She pried it open carefully, revealing the intricate wiring inside. Tom leaned forward. "What is that?" Dr. Langford didn't answer immediately. Her brow furrowed as she carefully examined the interior. "It's more sophisticated than I expected. This isn't a standard tracking device. It's layered. There's a signal transmitter, yes, but there's also a small data chip embedded deeper inside. Someone was collecting information." A cold knot formed in Tom's stomach. "Information about what?" Dr. Langford glanced at Buddy. "That's what we need to find out." She grabbed a pair of magnifying glasses and leaned in closer, her fingers moving delicately. "If I can sever the transmitter's connection without triggering any failsafe, we should be able to examine the data chip separately. But I need—" Before she could finish, the blinking red light flickered rapidly. A warning. Buddy let out a sharp bark, startling both of them. Tom grabbed his armrest, his pulse spiking. "What just happened?" Dr. Langford's eyes widened. "Someone's trying to access it remotely. We don't have much time." Her hands moved quickly now, her movements precise but urgent. She reached for a small tool and carefully snipped one of the thin wires connecting the transmitter. The red light flickered again, then went dark. Tom exhaled, barely realizing he had been holding his breath. "Did that stop it?" Dr. Langford nodded, but she didn't look relieved. "For now. But whoever was on the other end knows we've tampered with it. If they weren't watching before, they definitely are now." A shiver ran down Tom's spine. "So what do we do?" Dr. Langford carefully removed the data chip with a pair of tweezers, placing it in a small, protective case. "We analyze this. If there's any data stored inside, it might tell us who put this in Buddy, and why." Tom clenched his fists. "How long will that take?" Dr. Langford hesitated. "A few hours at best, a day at worst. I'll work as fast as I can." Tom nodded, though the weight in his chest remained heavy. "Okay. What should I do in the meantime?" Dr. Langford gave him a serious look. "Go home. Lock your doors. Stay with your parents. And most importantly, do not go outside alone." Tom stiffened. "You think they'll come looking for it?" She exhaled. "I think we just made them very, very angry." The walk home felt different. Every shadow seemed longer. Every rustling leaf sent his heart racing. Buddy stayed close to his side, his posture alert. Tom gripped his phone tightly, resisting the urge to check the security camera feed. He didn't want to see anything that might confirm his worst fears. When he stepped inside, his parents looked up from the living room, relief washing over his mom's face. "Tom! You were gone so long. Where did you—" "I went to see Dr. Langford." He shut the door behind him, locking it. "I found something. She's looking into it now." His dad set his coffee down. "Found what?" Tom hesitated, then pulled out his phone. He opened the security app and showed them the footage of the figure in the road. The slow, deliberate wave. His mom covered her mouth. "Oh my God." His dad stood, his face darkening. "That's not just some prank. That's someone targeting us." Tom nodded. "And I think it has to do with Buddy. I found a device buried in the park. Dr. Langford opened it up. Someone was tracking him, collecting data. She disabled it. But whoever was on the other end knew." His dad exhaled sharply. "We're calling the police." Tom's stomach twisted. "Dad, they already brushed it off once. What if they do it again?" "Then we make them listen." His dad grabbed his phone, already dialing. "This isn't paranoia. This is real." Tom sat down, running a hand through his hair. He wanted to believe the police would help, that they'd take it seriously this time. But a part of him knew the truth. Whoever was behind this was careful. They left no evidence. They were always one step ahead. The call was brief. The officer on the line assured them a patrol car would do another drive-by that evening, but there wasn't much else they could do without a direct threat. Tom's dad hung up, frustration etched into his face. "They said to stay inside, keep the doors locked, and call again if anything else happens." His mom wrapped her arms around herself. "That's not enough." Tom looked at Buddy, who sat at attention, ears perked. "I don't think this is over." The rest of the evening passed in uneasy silence. His parents double-checked the locks, closed all the curtains, and kept their phones within reach. Tom kept the security feed open on his phone, watching the empty street, waiting. And then, just after midnight, the motion alert chimed. Tom's heart lurched into his throat. He tapped the notification, the feed loading slowly, agonizingly. The figure was back, closer this time. Standing at the very edge of the driveway, just outside the camera's direct view. Watching. Tom's breath came shallow. His fingers hovered over the screen, uncertain whether he should wake his parents or just keep watching. Then, in one swift motion, the figure turned and started walking toward the house. Tom's pulse exploded. He scrambled up, shoving his phone into his pocket. "Dad, someone's here!" His dad bolted from his chair. "What? The camera! Someone's coming!" His mom gasped, reaching for her phone. His dad rushed to the window, peeking through the blinds, but by the time he looked, the driveway was empty. Tom pulled out his phone again, his hands shaking. He rewound the footage, playing it back. The figure had taken exactly 5 steps toward the house. Then the feed cut to static. Buddy let out a low growl, his body tense. Tom's dad grabbed his keys. "We're not waiting for this to go any further. Get in the car. We're going to Dr. Langford's now." Tom didn't argue. He grabbed his jacket, his heart racing, because deep down, he knew the truth. They weren't safe here anymore. Tom barely had time to react. The front door swung open with a slow, deliberate creak, revealing nothing but the pitch-black night beyond. No figure stood in the doorway. No shadow loomed. Just emptiness. And yet, the air inside the clinic shifted, thickening like a storm about to break. Buddy launched forward, his bark sharp and furious, but the sound was swallowed by the eerie silence that followed. Tom's dad grabbed his arm, pulling him back, while his mom reached for the nearest object, a glass paperweight from Dr. Langford's desk. Dr. Langford herself was frozen, her eyes locked on the doorway, her fingers twitching toward the computer. The intercom crackled again. The voice returned, distorted yet familiar. "Tom." His name echoed through the small clinic, bouncing off the walls like a whisper from the dark. Tom's breath hitched. He knew that voice. He had heard it before. In his bedroom. Outside his house. Now, it was here. Buddy's growl deepened, his body lowering into a defensive stance. But he wasn't looking at the doorway anymore. His gaze had shifted to the security monitors. Tom followed his dog's lead. The monitors flickered, static washing over the screens in chaotic bursts. Then, for a brief second, the image returned. Not the alley, not the empty street, but inside the clinic. A figure stood at the far end of the hallway, motionless, head tilted slightly to the side. The camera distorted their features, making them almost unrecognizable. Almost. But Tom knew what he was looking at. Himself. A sharp gasp escaped his mother. His dad took a step forward, shielding Tom instinctively. But no one moved beyond that. The image flickered again, the static returning, and when the screen cleared, the hallway was empty. "We need to get out of here," Tom's dad said, his voice firm. Dr. Langford snapped out of her frozen state. "The back door. It leads to the parking lot. We can—" The lights went out. Total darkness swallowed the clinic, plunging them into an abyss of uncertainty. Tom's breath came in short gasps. His heart pounded. Then, in the blackness, a single rhythmic sound emerged. Footsteps. Slow, measured, coming toward them. Buddy barked, lunging at the darkness, but his body met nothing. Tom clenched his fists, trying to steady himself. His dad gripped his shoulder tightly. His mom's breathing was ragged beside him. Dr. Langford moved first. "Go, now!" She grabbed a flashlight from her desk and flicked it on. The narrow beam cut through the darkness, landing on the hallway. Empty. Nothing was there. But they didn't wait. Tom's dad led the way, gripping his wife's hand, while Dr. Langford held the light steady. Tom held onto Buddy's leash as they moved swiftly toward the back exit. The air around them felt thick, heavy, like something unseen was pushing against them. Then, just as they reached the door, the flashlight flickered. The light dimmed, then died. A whisper curled through the air, just behind Tom's ear. "Don't leave." Tom spun, his back hitting the door. Buddy barked wildly, but again there was nothing. The shadows pressed against them, unseen but undeniably there. His dad fumbled with the lock. "Help me!" Tom snapped out of his daze and turned, yanking the door handle as hard as he could. It was stuck, jammed, like something was holding it shut from the other side. His mom pounded on the wood, desperate. Then the voice came again. "Stay!" A hand, a real, physical hand, gripped Tom's wrist. Cold, unnatural. He let out a sharp cry, yanking away as fast as he could. The door suddenly gave way, and they tumbled outside into the parking lot, the night air rushing over them like a wave of relief. Dr. Langford slammed the door shut behind them, locking it. For a moment, they all stood there, panting, eyes darting back toward the clinic windows. Nothing. Just the dark interior, as if nothing had happened. As if the thing inside had never been there at all. Tom's dad pulled out his phone and immediately called the police. His mom wrapped her arms around him, holding him tight. Buddy stood at his feet, still growling softly, but his stance was relaxed now, like he knew they had made it out. Dr. Langford wiped a hand over her face. That wasn't just a person. That was something else. Tom swallowed hard. It looked like me, on the monitor. I saw myself. His parents exchanged a glance. "What are you saying?" his mom asked softly. Tom shook his head. "I don't know. But whatever it was, it wanted me to stay." The sound of sirens filled the air, growing louder as red and blue lights flashed in the distance. Tom exhaled, trying to steady himself. When the police arrived, they found nothing inside. The security footage had been wiped. No evidence of the figure, no trace of the voice. Nothing to prove what had happened. But Tom knew. His parents knew. Dr. Langford knew. And Buddy had known from the start. They left town the next morning. His dad packed the car with everything they could fit, his mom making calls to secure a new place to stay. They didn't tell anyone the real reason for leaving. No one would have believed them. As they drove away, Tom watched the familiar streets disappear behind them. He didn't feel relief. Not entirely. Because as they passed the last streetlight before turning onto the highway, he saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the sidewalk. Watching. Waiting. And as the car sped past, it lifted a hand and waved.